Um, just want to say thank you, Brian, for the introduction and for organizing these and all the presenters that have presented before me. These have been very helpful. This is I don't know if I'd say a luxury, but certainly a good thing to have this summertime to work and prepare for the kind of resilient, flexible pedagogies and learning environments that we were asked to do in the spring, but not necessarily with the summer to prepare for that. So I'm certainly thankful for the ACM for putting these together and for the time to work on these. As Brian said, my name is Eric Dickens. You can just call me Eric. I use the he, his, him pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor of educational studies at Knox College, which is on Miskawa, Potawatomi, Miami, and Peoria, People's Lands. The topic for today, the title in the actual ACM email is Fostering Student Collaboration and Group Work in Online and Remote Virtual, I think, learning environments. There's a lot of adjectives in there, but I've tried to shorten it down a little bit to focus on a couple of the pieces here that I think are most relevant, and particularly using this word engineering. So I just put it as engineering student collaboration and group work. I also want to acknowledge and thank my invisible co-host of sorts, Kate Denial at Knox College. Unfortunately, Kate was not able to be here today. She had some family emergencies that came up, but she's been an incredible colleague in preparing this and working on this along the way. So even though I'm sort of flying solo today, I want to acknowledge all the help and support that Kate has given along the way. So let me just give like a very, very quick overview of what I'm hoping to cover today. We'll talk a little bit about this guiding principles behind this particular design that I rolled out in the spring and that I'll be refining and updating for the fall and want to share with people. I'm going to be talking about backwards design specifically. That's something that was addressed, I think, in the very first ACM workshop, but is something that I use quite heavily and in my classes actually teach my students to use. I teach mostly future teachers, and I teach a class that is about, in part, about lesson planning. So this is going to be very meta. I'm going to be teaching about a lesson planning strategy that I also teach my students to lesson plan for. Like I said, very, very meta. Yeah, so I'll be talking about how I applied that particular framework to this assignment on group work and student collaboration. And I'll be doing like a kind of deeper dive into how those pieces all kind of fit together. Then we'll take a break and have some discussions and debriefing about that. So as we begin, I want to make a couple of acknowledgements right from the beginning. And one is that when it comes to what I'm about to present today, I want to acknowledge that this is my vision, my way that I've worked on this. It is by no means the only way. It is by no means even necessarily the best way. I want to be very, very clear that what I'm presenting, I hope people find useful, but I also hope that people modify and create and go down different paths. This is just one way that this can be done, but absolutely feel free to make and carve out your own path for this. And I also want to address a phrasing issue. Maybe this is a little dry to this early in the morning get into semantics, but I don't think this is just semantics. I hear a phrase a lot when it comes to my students who, as I said, are future teachers, to colleagues, to teachers in the classroom, about encouraging student learning. They may not say student learning. It might say something like encourage group discussions, or encourage independent thought, or encourage critical thinking. And I understand what they mean by that, but I think if we change that verb slightly, we can think a little bit more critically about how we actually produce these kinds of results. So instead of using the phrase encouraging student collaboration or encouraging discussion, I would encourage you to change that to engineer student learning, engineer student discussion. And I use that term somewhat loosely. I don't know if we have any engineers in attendance, but I hope they will forgive me for a more liberal use of the term engineering. So the reason I make that distinction is when I think about encouragement, I think about support. Um, Taking somebody who is already along this path and giving them energy, giving them some guidance, giving them advice to continue on what they are already doing. And that might be all some of our students need in order to meet our expectations for something like student group discussions or collaboration. But I'd like to switch that a little bit and think about engineering. So instead of just encouraging students who are already sort of moving down that path, what can I do as an instructor, as an instructional designer, to engineer these particular situations that I have to think about the design that goes into it and intentionally plan for that. So engineering this engagement rather than just encouraging it. And as I said, I use very heavily this framework of backwards design. If you were in attendance earlier I guess it was in July, it might have actually been all the way in June, when we were talking about backwards design in these workshops. I'm going to give just a very, very brief 2-minute look at this, but I strongly recommend this book to pretty much anybody who teaches any class. So a lot of people. It's Understanding by Design by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe. The book is titled Understanding by Design, but their framework is backwards design. And there are a ton of workbooks and backwards design for units, backwards design for interdisciplinary studies. They've really gotten a lot of publicity and spread about this. So it's a very, very common way of thinking about instructional design, and I find it to be very useful. And at its core, what backwards design is trying to do is challenge a dominant way of thinking in planning, which is the activity first way of thinking. That a lot of times what people do, whether those are first grade teachers or college professors, that when they think about what is it that we're going to do on Tuesday, they think, well, what are we going to do? Like, what are the activities? What are the assignments? What are the things? They start planning out their agenda. And what backwards design does is put that in reverse and say, instead of thinking first about what you're actually going to be doing in class, start with thinking about what it is you want to accomplish. And this isn't a particularly revolutionary idea, but I really do like their terminology and their step-by-step with this. So they use the term desired results. So starting with your desired results, and you might think of those as your objectives or your learning outcomes or your goals, but start with that. And then this is the step that I think is actually very, very helpful. Don't just think about those goals, but think about what student mastery of that goal would look like. If you said you wanted students to engage in a sustained conversation, okay, so that's your result that you want to see happen. What does that look like? Determine the acceptable evidence. What if it was in front of you? Would you say, yes, that's evidence of a sustained conversation? And that might make you think, oh, well, the evidence would be that it continued on topic for 20 minutes. And once you start that, then you get to go to this last step of planning the learning experiences and instruction. And I've always thought that last stage is pretty vague, but once you get to this, I know I want them to be able to have a conversation for 20 minutes. Now I can start to think about, how do I get them there? And this is one thing they don't have in this graphic that I do think is also useful, is having some sort of formative assessment or pretest to see how close are particular students to meeting, to being able to create that acceptable evidence. And some might be very close and just need encouragement. Some might be very far away and you need to provide a lot more support, a lot more planning, particular experiences. So what I did is I took this concept of backwards design and applied it to a particular assignment that I used in the 2 classes that I taught this spring and that I'll be applying in the fall. And we'll probably keep using, whether we are fully online or partially online, for as long as I'm going to be having students doing online discussions, online group work. I'm going to be using some form of this. So I wanted to invest the time in thinking through this very intentionally, because it's a product and a process that I think is going to be very useful for me overall. So I actually need to double check something. Brian, just to double check, I'm looking at my screen. There's a little green line showing where it's cut off. If I went back to this last slide, can you see the citation that's at the bottom of that slide?
Yes.
You can? Okay. I wasn't sure if that green line meant that, that you weren't able to see the Wiggins and McTighe citation. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't always think in the most like technical terms. So I just thought of this as what does it mean? What do these mean to me? And specifically in this kind of thinking about a group discussion. So what are my desired results? What is this big ideal vision that I have of the most awesome small group discussion ever? Like, what does that look like in my head? Start closing my eyes, because this is what's fun for me, I guess, and try to imagine, like, what is that awesome, engaging, interesting discussion that I'm just like, wow, I can't believe my students did that. So that starts to help me conceptualize, like, what is that desired outcome? And then I start to think a little bit more deeply about that and say, all right, what is it that I specifically would want to see that I'd say, okay, that's why I like this. That's why they're meeting my expectations. That's why this discussion is so awesome. What is it that I'm looking at in the discussion that I'm saying, like, yes, that. And there I get to go to the, what do I need to do so that the students can actually create that evidence that I'm actually looking for? What do I need to provide? What do students need to engage in? So for me, thinking about these desired results, this is what I came up with. And I'm going to not read this out loud. I'm going to have just people take a look at this. Actually, I guess some people are on phone and they can't see the screen. So I will do my, the thing I don't try to do very often, which is reading from slides, but I guess it would make sense if you're on a phone. Okay, so for me, in this particular assignment, my desired results were students are well prepared for and engage in a deep, sustained discussion about the assigned readings that support each other's comprehension of the material and expands each other's ideas beyond the comprehension level, and that students build respectful, productive communities of learners. And that's the kind of thing that I don't know how that comes across to you, but if I saw that, it feels ambitious, it feels big, it feels awesome. If I saw students doing these things, I'd be like, yes, that's great. I can't believe they did that. I'm so happy they did. So this is the kind of big vision. But what I highlighted there in orange, I started looking at, okay, well, what is it that I'm actually looking for? What are the pieces in this big vision? What do I mean by, I said deep and sustained and well prepared. So that gets me thinking about, what do I need to do ahead of time? So then I start moving into that acceptable evidence. And I took what I had just written and started breaking this down into kind of specific evidence that I could be looking for. So I could look for that students before the discussion have thoroughly identified specific ideas from the reading that they did not understand well. And it wasn't just that they have read the readings or that they have seen that there are things that they did not understand well, but again, in orange, they have thoroughly, so I'm thinking about multiple things that they didn't understand well, that they've identified those things, and that they're specific ideas, that they're not just general thoughts about, well, I didn't really understand what the author was talking about. I really, really, really wanted to avoid in these discussions a lot of vagueness, a lot of just general kind of unproductive comments. I wanted to avoid comments like, yeah, I didn't really like the reading, or yeah, I didn't really get it, or yeah, there was a part where I remember thinking, that's pretty cool. Those kind of like unhelpful, unproductive comments. I wanted to tailor everything to avoid that. That was my, whatever the opposite of a desired result would be. So in addition, during the discussion, I wanted the students to be actively and consistently participating, building on each other's ideas. So there, again, highlighting in orange, I started thinking about some adjectives, the criteria of this evidence that their participation needs to be active, that they need to be actually contributing ideas. They need to not just be sitting back and listening passively, although, as I'll show you in a minute, I gave some pointers about active listening. And consistently, that these were going to be sustained conversations. I didn't want students to participate for the first 5 minutes and then just disappear. That I wanted during the discussion the students' contributions to be helpful, that they were adding to and advancing the discussion. So again, that the students' contributions weren't just general or off topic. I obviously encouraged text to self connections where they sort of recognize themselves or their own personal stories in what they're reading, but that can sometimes be a crutch for students who didn't read the readings very well or didn't really engage very cognitively with it. And they're just taking a big idea, and that gives them license to then kind of talk for 5-10 minutes about what their life is like. And that can be very valuable, but I wanted the conversation to be, and if that was in it, that's fine. But I wanted the core of the conversation to be about advancing and adding to each other's ideas based on what they were reading. And lastly, during the discussion, all the students asked their clarifying questions and shared their ideas about the readings. So again, I wanted these contributions to not just be helpful and that people weren't just participating, but the way that there was a sense of shared responsibility, that everybody would have a chance to ask their questions and share their ideas. So actually, before I get to the rubric, I want to just kind of take a small step back and clarify in case it wasn't clear. This assignment was a group assignment that I had developed for 2 classes that I taught in the spring. At Knox, we're on trimesters. So when our school moved to online only right around spring break, we were actually beginning a brand new term. So when we started these classes that I'm talking about, my students had actually, many of them had never met each other before. We weren't continuing a class that had been previously face-to-face. And most of what I'm talking about today is coming from or applying to a assignment that I used in my adolescent development class, which is a psychology and education cross-listed course. And the idea was I have readings that students do before class. They have questions that they can engage with as they're reading. But what I knew I'd be missing as we moved online was the chance for them to speak with each other, to talk with each other, to build their understanding of the readings. And typically in a face-to-face setting, that might be small group discussions at their tables where they've got the readings out and they're sort of adding on to each other's ideas, et cetera. So moving to an online environment, this assignment tried to kind of replicate that and fill that in. And yeah, so this is all my kind of like planning to get to that particular assignment that served that function in the overall class. So what I find helpful is once I got this acceptable evidence, especially those parts that are in orange there, once I can start to name and identify the specific things that I want to see that I think would be meeting my expectations for this big vision, I can take these specific ideas and move them right into my rubric. So I have here on the screen the rubric that my students used and I used for this assignment. You do not need to look at this very closely. In fact, don't bother. It's shared. You can look at that in your own time. But what I wanted to highlight is the part that's highlighted there in orange, that these criteria don't just come from out of nowhere. They really come about after I've thought about the specific evidence. So I'm going to hop back and forth here for a second. So if you look at the very first bullet point, before the discussion, students have thoroughly identified specific ideas from the readings they did not understand well. So if I knew that's what I wanted my students to be able to do, it already started formulating for me that they're going to have some method for taking notes about or getting feedback on what they didn't understand or what misconceptions they may have from the readings. So, and I will show this much more in a moment, but I created a form, a template for students to write down their questions that they had as they were reading. So that particular piece of evidence translates directly to the very first orange square there. Under planning thoroughness, it says all prompts in preparation notes are answered. So that helps me see that they have thoroughly thought about things that they did not understand. And the second point, the second grading point about planning specificity asks for them to give citations. So I'm not necessarily needing those in typical kind of note taking, but if my evidence for my desired result is that students are not just speaking in general senses about big ideas, but referring to having identified specific ideas that they did not understand, one way I thought I could make that clear and show that expectation is to require them in the rubric here to have citations. So again, you don't need to like try to absorb everything that's in this rubric. I just wanted to show the big process that going from a big vision of this desired results to naming the specific evidence I'm looking for. And once I've named them, the rubric for me quantifies that and makes it very clear, what do I mean by, let me give another example, actively and consistently participating. So that comes through in the third grading point, consistently engaged throughout the discussion by leading the discussion, contributing ideas, and actively listening. And at the bottom, which I think you can see, there's a note about what does active listening actually mean. So that, again, I could not have created this rubric in this detail unless I had first come up with that desired result and that acceptable evidence. So the planning that goes into just this rubric alone really starts by focusing my kind of bigger visions about that. So we used Google Classroom as our LMS. Everything I'm saying works fine with Canvas, Moodle, any other LMS. The specific reason I chose Google Classroom is in large part actually because of this assignment. The template that I'm going to show here in a minute and is shared on Slack and I think in the chat maybe as well, for students to write down their notes in preparation for this discussion. There's a very handy feature in Google Classroom that once you create the file, you can, a Google Doc or it could be anything technically in Google Drive, but Google Doc or Google Slides or whatever, you can make it an assignment. And then when you make it an assignment, there's a tick mark that says students each receive their own copy. So I have this template with prompted questions. I make it an assignment on Google Classroom and the students see that assignment and fill it out. It has a deadline associated with that at the end of the week for me. They submit it and then I can see all of their notes and grade that as the actual assignment. The other thing that I did as far as like Google Classroom, whatnot, is we use Google Meet. I think we'll be using Zoom in the fall, but again, this will work pretty well. I did ask students to record their conversations and I gave some support for that. There was one person who was the designated leader who one of their job responsibilities was to be the one person who recorded the video and shared it with me. So I didn't have several students emailing me about a file. And yeah, and that they had opt-out opportunities. They could do over the phone or they could opt out of the assignment completely. Was there another question that I may not have answered? I'm gonna be talking about those like forms and supports. Well, actually, I'll just jump into it now. So once I thought about that desired result, that desired evidence, that got me to start thinking about like, what all do I need to do to get them there? What all do my students need to be engaged in order for them to produce the evidence that I'm looking for? And I think of this in terms of Vygotsky and scaffolds. So for me, it's not just about like the learning experiences, but from an instructor standpoint, an instructional design standpoint, thinking about the scaffolds, the supports that I'm creating and providing for the students to use. So I broke this down kind of at the beginning of the term. I created the rubric, I created the instruction sheet to clarify what the expectations are and gave that to the students as soon as possible. I also created semi-persistent groups with those defined roles. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Yeah, let me just save that. So I did have assigned groups with a couple of assigned roles, and something that'll be new for me in the fall that I did not have in the spring is now I have these videos. I have examples of videos that I can share with my students. I can post them and say, take a look at these. This is what I'm looking for. I can show them a 3-4 minute clip of an excellent conversation that meets and exceeds my expectations. So they have a nice visual of what my expectations are. Then as we prepared for these assignments, as we prepared for these discussions, I had to make sure that the readings that the students were going to be talking about were accessible. I mean that in terms of available, that they could actually get them. That's where Google Classroom or even just sharing a Google Drive folder or any other LMS was my particular way. But I also mean that I went through and had the Office of, I think we actually still call it Office for Students with Disabilities, take a look at the files to see if there were any issues with readability, if there was any sort of formatting issues, and kind of let students know that if they wanted to, because the files were shared ahead of time, they could start clicking through and opening them up and just making sure that if they had any particular exceptional accommodations that they needed, we could spot that ahead of time. So they had the readings available with plenty of advance notice. They were readable, accessible. I also used Google Forms to create a quiz that was based on the readings, and I'll show that and talk more about that. And then again, there was this document that was a preparation notes template that sort of guided their and supported their reflection and thinking about what they've been reading in preparation for the discussion. And during the discussion itself, I let the students choose their own meeting time. And so in that way, it's kind of funny. So it was synchronous for them, but it was asynchronous from the class, if that makes sense. The students, without really any input from me, I just asked them to, once they were in their group, pick a time that worked for them. For me, structurally, the way that I rolled this out is I have a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, or I should say this class is a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 70-minute a day kind of traditional 1-credit class. What I had the students do is there was, instead of a day, there was a topic. So what I would have in the old version called like Monday's work and Wednesday's work was topic 1 and topic 2. And for Friday, instead of engaging in kind of new topics, they would have these discussions. So it was a discussion at the end of the week based on what they had read in topic 1 and topic 2, which for everybody else is just Monday and Wednesday. And yeah, so this particular template, this notes, they were assigned it via Google Classroom on Monday. They had all the readings and the quizzes. They had some lectures and videos and from me and from other people about these topics. And they had whatever time they wanted to take to look at these. What I suggested that they do is that they work on all of that preparation work Monday, Tuesday, at latest Wednesday night. But by Thursday morning, they should be looking for times to meet with their group. So Thursday and Friday, essentially all day, all night, they could choose when their group was to meet. And it's very obvious from the time that in the file, it tells you when it was recorded. Some of my students were meeting as a group at 9 a.m. on Thursday, and some were doing this at 9 p.m. on Friday, but that's fine. It was their choice. They found the time that worked for them. I also asked them to budget in some flex time. I can talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but I wanted them to have an ability to get to know each other and talk with each other. So I encouraged them to spend some time before, there's that word encourage, see it slips in, to talk with each other before they started recording the conversation. So if there was anything sort of personal or private that they didn't want to share, that was off the radar. So they had some autonomy in the scheduling of this. I had some supports about how they would hold each other accountable for their preparation and their engagement. And I tried to facilitate the kind of fluent retrieval and the being able to talk about what they had read and what thoughts they had by providing them this talking points card, which was part of the preparation notes. And I'll show all those in a second. But my point kind of overviewing on this slide, all of that is to really kind of come back to that idea that this is what I mean by engineering, that this work to get students to this place where they can produce the evidence that I'm looking for, it's not as simple as suggesting or putting some discussion questions out there or putting out some prompts and saying, I want y'all to talk about this. There's a lot more intentional planning and designing that goes into that so that they're able to achieve what it is that I'm looking for.
Hey, Eric, before you go on, there's one question that may be timely.
Sure.
And it has to do with inclusion. The question is, do you feel that the rubric sufficiently addresses inclusion? I have students of color tell me they are talked over, ignored in group work, and I've observed students have difficulty with neurodiverse students. Do you do any work on how to have a discussion that is inclusive and supportive?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I'm very happy to hear people thinking about that. So a couple things that I did, let me see. Yeah, so it's actually right here on this slide. One thing that I think helped with that is, though this particular class had not been meeting face-to-face beforehand and the students didn't necessarily know each other, I actually asked them to email me who in the class, and they can see the roster in the LMS, they already had some experience with and that they were comfortable having conversations with. I chose that phrasing so they understood that this wasn't just about like, okay, who do I think is the student who's going to do the best job on an assignment, or who's going to write a good paper. It was tell me people that you see their names and you know from previous experiences you may have had with them in previous classes or outside of class, that you feel comfortable talking with them. So that's one small way. So I prioritized these pre-existing connections. They emailed me and I looked over that. They could explain why they chose the people that they did. It didn't line up perfectly where everybody had the exact same answers. So I had to sort of talk to some students and check like, okay, this person would like to be with this person. Can I put them with this group? So I had to do some kind of like reviewing of what their email said in order to make the groups. So that's one part. As far as the rubric goes, specifically the part about like talking over, yeah, there's a lot of issues with, I don't know if this is a term people hear or know a lot, but like the female pause, men interjecting their voices as women may tend to step back and think before they speak a bit more, and men just throwing their ideas in front of them. This is something we see a lot in like high school classes and classrooms that I teach. So the norms for conversation, whether that's based on gender, culture, or individual exceptionalities, having people that they felt comfortable with, that they could choose, is part of that. And the rubric, you may have noticed at the bottom, there was a point about shared grading. I wrestle with this and go back and forth a lot about any kind of grading that is kind of in common for everybody. I did have one component in here, but it really wasn't about the grading as much as it was about making clear that you're all responsible for each other contributing. Going back to that desired results and acceptable evidence, I wanted this to not just be dominated by a few students. I wanted this to be something that everybody was contributing to. And if certain voices weren't being heard, that there was space made for them. As far as planning goes, that may have been as far as I was thinking. Now, when the discussion started happening, I was watching these and listening and ready to provide some feedback to students if I felt like they were talking over others or dominating the conversations too much, or other people were not seemed to be uncomfortable. I didn't have any students bring this up with me via email directly, so it was just sort of my observation. But as far as the like preparation for that, the aspect that I have them all be part of their grade is that not that everybody necessarily did this work, but that everybody's ideas and questions were asked. And something I found a lot. I should also add that, and I'll show you this again in a second in the sheet, but one of the roles that was defined is the facilitator role. And that person's job specifically was to make sure that everybody had had a chance to raise what questions they had. And so because there was a requirement for it, because there was a person in the group who was designated to make sure that everybody contributed and said what they wanted to say to the conversation, that was sort of my design to provide that space, and understanding that designing it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. So I was still watching and responding there. But I have to say I was very, very impressed, very happy with how even the conversations were, and that almost every single video, there's about an N of about 20 now, the students would say, does anyone else have anything that they wanted to say? Did everyone get a chance to speak? Take a look at your talking points note. Does anybody else have anything? And that may have started with a feeling of, well, I have to do this because it's my role, or I have to do this because if I don't, we're going to lose points. But the goal was simply that I had intentionally designed that kind of space in there. So I also provided at the beginning the rubric, which you saw, and I'll show the, well, I'll skip to it because I'm going to move my screen here in a second. But the exemplar video is what I was talking about before. Now that I have these clips, I'm planning on posting those in the fall. And depending on how much video editing I want to do, or if I just want to post a written doc of saying, look at this video, take a look at the rubric. Here is why this group scored at the highest level. Look at this particular moment. This is an example of what I'm looking for. So I've also shared the instruction sheet. Let me see if I can switch over so you can see that. Stop. Screen. Can you see the instruction sheet? Okay. So again, this was provided all ahead of time in here. And I've already said a lot of this, so I'm not going to repeat as much. You can look through this in your own time. But let me see, there was one or two things. So I try to be very clear with this purpose, that it's about clarifying your understanding, because I would not have as much opportunity to hear what they're saying in class and kind of address individual or common misconceptions. I wanted them to support each other in that way, with me listening and asynchronously after their discussion, kind of chiming in with additional information if they were still confused. But clarifying the understanding was a big thing, and then going beyond that comprehension, starting to think more deeply, more broadly, making different connections to different classes, to different ideas, to their own experiences. So I highlight those because they come directly from the rubric, and they come into the instruction sheet, and then you'll see them again in the document, the preparation notes themselves. Here's where I talk about the roles. Again, I already said most of this, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but this discussion facilitator is in charge of keeping the discussion going, assuring everyone is contributing, prompting all peers to think more deeply on topics, ensuring everybody's questions have been answered, and clarified what they need to do ahead of time, what do they need to have out. Again, the fourth requirement on during the discussion is ensure that everybody has contributed. All of these comments really tie back to the rubric. But one last thing I want to point out is actually this last sentence here in on the instruction sheet. I felt like it was important to acknowledge to them, especially as this was the first online learning that most of them had been engaged in. I felt like it was really important that I acknowledge that, yes, this is challenging work. This is stuff that is not going to be kind of typical. So getting them kind of an acknowledgement of like, this is going to be difficult. This is going to be challenging to have these online discussions, but it is a valuable thing. Okay, so what else did I want to show on this? I think on that discussion sheet, the instruction sheet, I'm just going to leave that be, so you can take a look at that as you like. Let me talk a little bit about the prior to the discussion, the actual quizzes and the preparation notes. So I think people can see my my folders here. So when they had their assigned readings and then each of them having a quiz, I made the decision. This is a choice some may choose not to do, but what I made the decision that I wanted them to have the feedback from these quiz questions prior to their discussion. So I changed the settings in Google Forms, or the quiz in Google Forms, that their results were emailed to them. And that way they had an email with their answers and not just shown on screen. And they didn't have to like wait for me. In a typical class, they can see their score and they see which questions they got wrong, but they don't see the right answer. I changed that because in a typical face-to-face class, I would be able to see that score. I'd see the questions that were commonly missed, and I'd address it in class. And they would have this quiz kind of to prepare for that. But knowing that they wouldn't have the chance to hear from me in class right after they, or even just 24 hours or so after they took the quiz, I wanted them to see the answer. And there's a way in Google Forms to write a little something that explains why the answer is correct. So they took these, they took those quiz results, and I think you can see this now. This is the notes. This is the big document that I found most useful and was kind of the centerpiece of this all, this discussion preparation notes. So I tried to be very clear about the step-by-step instructions. It's a little confusing, so I wanted to have just a single page that said step 1, step 2, step 3, do this. So for topic 1, which was whatever it was for Monday, they had these boxes to fill in. And what most students did is just copy and paste from their quiz questions that they got wrong. And then in number 2, it was anything else that they wanted to ask about, things that they may have gotten correct on the quiz but still don't understand, or from the readings and the materials they were looking at before class, any other questions that they had. This is where they wrote that in with citations. So the first goal of clarifying misconceptions, and then going beyond this open-ended kind of prompt of what is it that you found interesting, significant, what connections did you make? Again, these are places where they could write in their own comments with citations. So those 4 questions for the first, like the Monday readings or the topic 1. They had the exact same thing for topic 2 or Wednesday's readings. There was a quiz where they posted their missed questions. There was a space here for them to write down questions that they still had, and then ideas and connections that they made. So all of that intentional thinking, intentional reflecting on what they had just read was helpful, but it doesn't necessarily help them in medias res, in their actual discussions. So the last part of the notes was they had to take what they had written up above and kind of trim it down a little bit. And this one sheet, the talking points card or talking points sheet, is what I wanted them to have up as they discussed. So they didn't have to go looking through all of their notes and all their handwritten notes and all of the pages up above. This is their one space. And I kind of stole this from watching some high school classes where students were giving speeches and they were allowed like one note card that they could refer back to. That's how I thought of this. Here's the shorthand, quick reference, essential things that you need to have at your right on hand. So for misconceptions, anything that they did not understand, which would be questions 1 and 2 from Monday's topic and from Wednesday's topic, they pasted in here, and they could then just choose what something that a connection they made or a question they had or something they found surprising or interesting from either one of those days, they could copy and paste here. And some students did that. Some students just copied and pasted what they had above. But the whole trick was to have this one quick reference guide. Let's see. So I think I'm not sure if I show, yeah, I'll just have to move back to this one. So I've got some examples on the screen here of students' work from this sheet. And you can see like in this top left one, the student had copied the question from the quiz and highlighted what they missed. Going beyond, the student had written down what they found interesting, what connections they had. And these are different students, so these comments don't necessarily all follow. But here's their talking points, like here's the questions that I missed, here's the questions that I missed, here's this thing that I want to make sure I contribute. So the grading about the one common grading element that was about everybody contributes is about the talking points. Did everybody speak about what was on their talking points? And that made it very specific to be able to say, did everybody say what was on their talking point sheet? And until they did, or if they did not, until they did, they really couldn't end the discussion. So that gave a very concrete, specific thing to say, look at the talking point sheet. Have you talked about all of those things on yours? Is anybody else still have something on there? And it becomes a communal responsibility that if someone hasn't said something that they had a question about or an idea and connection, that they had beforehand really worked through this process to identify it. It's not every thought that came to their mind. This is the one particular sharing that they wanted to make sure is said. And if they don't have a chance to say that, that would be a problem for me. So I wanted to make sure that that was built in structurally and understood that was a requirement. And that this all kind of fits together with what I was just saying about this during the discussion. By choosing the time and the group themselves, by working with pre-existing conditions, I think it helped establish a sense of flexibility and tone. It became very clear very quickly that students were getting pretty comfortable with each other. I laughed at how many times students were lounging on their couches or lounging on their beds and just very, very casual. And that's perfect for me because they're sitting there on the couches. Their cats are at their feet, but they're having a discussion about adolescent sleep patterns for 30, 40 minutes. I'm like, that's fine. That is my desired result for sure. And again, having this sense of accountability of, yes, there's a common grade, but it really wasn't about the grade. It was about building the structures and supports, setting the clear expectations, setting the facilitator role, setting that talking point card so that it was clear what it is when we say everyone contributes, quantifying that and naming that so that people can say like, well, do we feel like everyone's contributed? And that might feel like everyone has, but someone's in the corner who hasn't really said much. But if you say, okay, look at your talking point sheet. Has everybody said what's on that sheet? It's a lot harder, I think, with that design to exclude people. And again, I had another video here to add up, but I think for time and connection issues, we should just kind of leave that be. So the last thing before we break, I just want to mention that what I did as far as after the discussion is I watched these videos and then I graded their preparation notes as an assignment within Google Classroom. And I could make comments and say things like, I really thought what you said about your school doing this was a really insightful comment, or I noticed that you weren't really clear about this. Here's how I would explain it differently. And Google Classroom has some nice features for letting you reuse comments. They have a comment bank. So if there was a misconception or a clarification that I was making for a lot of students, I could just put that in the bank and then just paste that into each students that I graded that had that misconception. But something I moved toward the end, which I wanted to do earlier, but I was primarily doing text. But by the end, I was doing video comments. So I found it easier to just say to the class what my feedback was, and I felt like it was a chance for them to also kind of connect with me a little bit. So I started posting on YouTube, and this is the screenshot from my feedback for their fourth discussion. What I did was I started with a overview of the common misconceptions that I was hearing, and I just live streamed this and recorded it on YouTube. And after I went through those common misconceptions that everyone seemed to say, I then went to each group and directed some specific feedback to things that they said in that group. So one group might say like, oh, I felt like it was this, and everyone kind of agreed. And in my head, I'm watching it and saying like, no, that's not accurate. So I would say, okay, for team 22, so-and-so said this, but that's not actually accurate. Let me be clear. If you look on page blank, this is what it actually means. And YouTube lets you leave timestamps or put down in the comments a timestamp. So I told them, watch the first part, and then you can just zoom ahead to the feedback for your particular group. Okay, so that's more than enough talking for me. So I think this is I jump in just to, because I think some of those were about this, like people were asking about my particular framing, and I want to expand this and get other people, but I felt like there were maybe some things I didn't clarify, or I kind of skip over a little bit to that can kind of help elucidate it a bit. So one of the things about backwards design, I think, is very helpful in helping give a structure for answering these kinds of questions about equitability, about access, about opportunity. So the way that I jumped in talking about desired results for this particular assignment, you could go a level up and say, for me, what is the purpose of this particular assignment in the larger class? What role does this particular assignment play? What is it that I'm hoping it accomplishes? And I alluded to this a little bit about how this is something of a replication of the in-class discussions where students are talking to each other about their own ideas. But it also gives me a way to then think about what kinds of alternative assignments and learning experiences I might have students engage in, because I'm not thinking about the activity first. If I have students who, for whatever reason, it might be social emotional, it might be anything along those lines, but it could also just be technological, that they may be very happy and able to have no particular challenges with speaking in groups, but their internet is unreliable, or they're traveling a lot, and for a totally different reason, this particular assignment is not going to work for them. If I go back to that, the first thing is, what am I trying to get out of this? The role of this is about clarifying misconceptions so that students have a chance to check their understanding before something more major like an exam, and that I can check in with them on that, but also for them to expand and go beyond that. So if that's the goal, I'm not like wedded to this particular assignment. I can now think of other ways that students could accomplish those same goals. So students could meet with me individually, one-on-one live, or record themselves separately, or if they don't feel comfortable doing that, they could simply share their notes, and I may maybe ask them to go a little deeper into what they wrote, so that I can more clearly see what they're thinking about. The kind of things that they'd be articulating in spoken word that may not be written down exactly, but it doesn't, in a way, the discussion itself doesn't really matter. What matters is students clarifying their misconceptions, students putting out their own ideas, students thinking deeply about what they're reading. and the particular form or activity that occurs in
Yeah.
is tertiary. So backwards design, I think, is the way for me that I start thinking about that. The other thing is, as far as like an equity, obviously there's lots of reasons why this kind of assignment wouldn't work for them. But something I'm always thinking about is, I don't remember where I heard this first, but that clarity is kindness. One of the things I really kind of cringe at seeing is the kind of hidden expectations, the hidden curriculum, the assumption that a student will do X, Y, and Z, and I'm grading them on that, but I'm not being clear about that. I'm not supporting it. I'm not scaffolding it. So for me, I made the intentional choice in this assignment that they will be discussing with their peers if they chose to do this assignment. But instead of simply saying generically that you contributed equally, or that you that everybody had a chance to speak, or that you said 5 things within 30 minutes, by having the exemplar videos, by having the rubric and the instruction sheet, my goal there was to be very clear about what I meant when I said actively engaged, for example. So yeah, I think it's pretty transparent that there are a lot of skills about group discussion, about preparation, about engagement that are requirements for succeeding in this particular assignment. But what I tried to do is, while being available for alternative ways of accomplishing my instructional goals, for those that chose this particular path, to be very explicit and very clear about those expectations, about that criteria, so they weren't being graded down on something that they didn't even realize that they were being asked to do, if that makes sense. So yeah, there's a
That was great.
so yeah, I strongly encourage people that as you think about doing, if you were going to do something like this, these particular materials are within this particular assignment, but in my syllabus, I have options for students to take if they didn't want to participate in these groups. I should also say it kind of was shown and may be clear, but students could choose to use pseudonyms when they sign up. Students could choose to not have their video on. What I found, and this, I also mentioned that these were semi-persistent groups, so I left open the possibility that I might need to change the groups based on what I was observing, if there were people being silenced, or if there were people that this was clearly not working for. Maybe they didn't know or were comfortable kind of pre-identifying that they wanted to do a different way of showing what they were understanding, what questions they had, and something like an individual conference would work better. And after 2 videos, I'm like, okay, this person probably needs a different assignment. I might reach out to them, and that's why they're semi-persistent groups, because there's the opportunity for it to change.
Hey, Eric, there is a question. I don't think we'll have time to do breakout groups, but there is a
Sure.
question that's come up a few times, and that is, what is your investment of time to grade all of the recordings and to be engaged along the way as you're talking about, as you're describing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, probably the scariest, I don't know if anyone saw this, but this would be the scariest thing in here. If you, can y'all see my slides? I'm not sure which screen I'm sharing. Actually, I don't even think I'm sharing my screen right now.
Not yet.
Okay, I will. But the feedback that I gave for the video discussions, I just did that as like a live chat, so I wasn't watching my time too closely. So I just kind of took notes as I was listening. And if I present this, let me see if that shows. I think my video feedback was something like let me see, was an hour and 18 minutes. And that's long. That's very long. But that's also for 4 groups. Each group was probably about 15 minutes of recording. But I also did it, like I said, kind of, very informally. It was really just me talking to them, like sharing in the jokes. A lot of times they would be like, one of them wrote a poem and shared it in the group, and I had to, I made a comment about that. So the feedback was instructive, but it was also affective, I think. Not that those are necessarily separate. So yeah, if you look on the screen, it shows like an hour and 18, but that was just me doing what I'm doing right now, putting on the webcam and recording. The whole group was something like 30 minutes, and then like 15 minutes to talk about it. One other affordance of watching the videos asynchronously is I could change the playback speed. So what I would do is I would be kind of looking at something else, maybe I might just be like cleaning up my office or something and listening to the conversation at a faster speed. And then as they started to talk about a particular thing that was a misconception, or someone had an interesting idea, I'd like go and like start focusing a bit more, because the discussions were 40 minutes each, and I'm sensitive to how time multiplies. So I had 2 classes with 4 groups each. So in just one class in 1 week, when they had 4 videos, that's 40 minutes to watch the video, which is why I did it at like a slightly faster speed. So let's say even 30, 35 minutes to watch the video, but I'm pausing it, I'm typing down notes. It probably took me about an hour to an hour and a half for each video, which is a lot. I do think that that's maybe me going overboard. But especially as the first time doing this, I kind of went overboard. I think for the fall, knowing ahead of time what are some of those common misconceptions, I might have those comments already saved and notes already written. So I don't necessarily have to pause it and be like, oh, that's something that I want to address. And to me, that's basically similar to like what would happen in class, where as soon as a student starts saying like, well, I didn't understand what they meant by this particular study, and I'm like, oh, that's right. Yes, that's something that I'm prepared to talk about. So the format changed. I think it took a little bit longer to give that feedback, but I found it really, really valuable. And because I wasn't holding synchronous class lessons each week, I kind of took that as this is the hour and a half, or the hour and 10 minutes, I should say, that I would typically be spending 3 times a week to watch these and give some kind of detailed feedback.
And just to note, there a couple of questions about how large, how many students would be in each group, but then there are also some resources for those of you who are watching along in the chat, some resources that people are sharing about group formation and in response to some of the questions that have come up about how to engineer or repopulate groups.
So I used a hard cap of 4. There was one group of 2. Most of the groups were 3 or 4. I came to that because I thought about how long did I want these discussions to go. I thought if I asked them to do an hour-long conversation, that would be too long. If I added in, I really preference 3, but if there were 4 people in a group, I thought everyone would have a chance to speak and talk within that time. The first week I did watch very closely to see, okay, it's 40 minute, excuse me. Sorry. One of the advantages of watching it asynchronously is you know exactly how long the discussion ends up being. So I could see that the conversation did go for 40 minutes. And if I have a group of 4 and I'm watching and seeing this person is talking a long, long time, I can actually go back and look and see, yeah, they only talked for like 3 or 4 minutes, or this other student only talked for 3 or 4 minutes. It's nice to have to know ahead of time how long the actual conversation will be, so you can start to think how to like monitor and measure people's the equitability of the conversation. But yeah, three for me was the sweet spot. And there are a lot of different ways to split up groups. That's something that I think I kind of leaned heavily on pre-existing relationships, and I'm thinking about for the fall, where I'm going to have more students who don't have experience with each other. I will probably meet with students individually at the beginning of class. Well, I do that anyway, but I will include in my my beginning of the year meetings with students questions about if they know people, if they've had these kinds of assignments, if they've had these kinds of roles before, to try to get a sense of what kinds of like connections there might be, or people who are similar. and understand that I might be totally wrong, and 2 weeks into it need to shuffle the groups up.
We are at about 3 minutes until top of the hour. Are there any other pressing questions or concluding thoughts?
Could I ask one quick question?
Of course.
This is Katie Rogers from Co. Did you have them do it every week?
Yeah, I actually did not. We were on 10-week terms. We had a shortened schedule because of extending the spring break. So we actually only did 4 of these over the course of the term. That's something I'm kind of wrestling with for the fall. But when we did not have these assignments, we met as a whole class on a Friday to do basically like a exam review session. So my vision was, timeline wise, they read, they take a quiz. I should also note that the quizzes were only less than 1 point on their final grade each. And I make that very clear. So I'm not super concerned about them emailing their answers to somebody else and, oh my gosh, they're cheating, because it does very little to help their actual grade. And it becomes clear if they haven't actually done that work in the preparation. I thought it like they read, they get a little feedback from the quiz, then they have this discussion with a small group where they get more feedback and they start to solidify their understanding. And then before the exam, though, I wanted a chance where I could not just meet with the individual groups and give asynchronous feedback, but to have an open synchronous Q&A session with a review sheet to kind of hear from people, hear individual questions. And of course, there were like email channels and chat channels and office hours and things like that. But timing wise, I'm going to have to think about if I had a larger class. So I have 12 in this class in the fall. I will probably do 4 groups of 3. So if that is something I'm going to assign them every week, I'm only going to be able to do that if I have like my video lectures, my readings, the quizzes, and all the other kind of work done. And then I'm primarily responsible for this. That being said, what I'm actually thinking about for the fall is, instead of doing the video feedback, that I will watch these videos, write my notes, and then meet with that group face-to-face. That's the face-to-face component that I'm looking for in the fall is, you tell me a time when we can meet. I'm going to start the bidding at our Wednesday or Friday class time, and we will have that 15 to 20 minute small group discussion, me and the 3 or 4 students in that group, where I've watched their video, I'm giving them comments, but we're doing it face-to-face to get that component in. And for students who are completely remote or who won't be able to meet in person, I have this format to fall back on, where they can, I can do like video feedback and sharing comments that way.
Great. Well, we have reached 11 o'clock. So let me just jump in and say thank you, Eric, for sharing these resources and thoughts with us. And thank everyone for being here. And those of you who have been here for many of the sessions previously in prior weeks, thank you for doing that. And those of you who have led those sessions, I'm looking at a few of you on the screen. Thank you for that. We will be, as I said, we'll be